Mr. Grothman, for 30 minutes.
Thank you. I think one more time today it's important to update the chamber as far as what's going on with the biggest crisis in America today, and that is, of course, the virtual invasion across our southern border. We recently had published an estimate of the number of people who crossed the southern border in April, the most recent month available, and that number is about 204,000. Per usual, April is usually a low month, but per usual, it appears as though we hit the all-time record number of people coming here in April. A year ago, it was about 178,000. A year before that, about 160,000. And if you go back to the final year that President Trump was president, it was about 6,000. So we have gone from about 6,000 people, which is apparently doable, to about 205,000. And during that time, President Biden, through executive orders, has changed the policy and is also allowing about 30,000 people here as parolees from countries such as Haiti, such as Venezuela, such as Cuba. So that number of 204,000 is really probably understated by about 30,000. Our country continues to struggle with this. It is very expensive, although that's not the biggest problem, be it schools, be it medical care. Even in my district, when I talk to people who have tried to put together free clinics, used to getting Medicaid payments, that sort of thing, they find, one of them told me even a majority of people they're having to take care of, in essence charity, are people who are here, what some people would describe as illegal immigrants. And I assume that the number of illegal immigrants who are unaccompanied minors continues to be a concern. We have about 6,000 of the 205,000 unaccompanied minors. We heard testimony about this recently, but we still do not know exactly where all these folks are. We don't know if they are living with a so-called relative, whether we are consistently giving DNA tests to see whether it really is a relative. We know that the New York Times published articles that guess that there are tens of thousands of unaccompanied minors not accounted for. It would be very easy to solve this problem. You reinstitute the stay in Mexico policy. You get a parole, and by the way, with parole, you get automatic, what we'd refer to as welfare benefits. As soon as you come here, you get rid of these programs, and this drive to change America would change almost overnight. We can never forget that Barack Obama, living in the greatest country in the world, the United States, during his term, felt that one of his goals would be to fundamentally change America. And when you change the people in America, how they're brought up, how they think about things, you will fundamentally change America. The greatest country in the history of the world. The only reason you continue to let, as far as I can see, about 250,000 people coming here every month is because you do want to change it and want it to be different. So I call upon President Biden to return to the stay in Mexico policy, and I think primarily by doing that, you could get that 250,000 figure back around 20 or 10,000 almost overnight. But again, the takeaway for this body and for the American public should be one more time in April, and we should never get bored of saying it, it appears one more time in April, we hit the all-time high for an April of the number of people crossing into our nation. What I thought was the biggest crisis in the country when I became a congressman, now I guess I'd have to say it's second to the border, is the continued assault on marriage and the breakdown of the family. When I talk to people in my district, they know something's wrong. In some ways, America is different than the America they knew in the 1990s, the 1970s, the 1960s. And you ask them what the change is, they frequently say the number one change is the breakdown of the American family. The end of the old-fashioned mother and father and children at home as we slowly increase the number of children who are born without a father in the household. And of course, this is a problem two ways. It's a problem for the children by every metric. They'd be better off if they had a mom and dad at home. It's also a problem for the men in society, as usually men get their self-worth out of supporting their family. And as we have more and more families in which is an immigrant in my district tells me, in America or some communities, the woman marries the government. And because we have a situation of which we're encouraging the woman to marry the government, we have a situation in which the men are no longer have their, what is for most men, their most important function in life, and that is supporting their wife and supporting their children. So now we have to see what is being done. I want to point out, by the way, that this is not a coincidence. When I talk to people around my district and say, why do you think this family is breaking down? Maybe they shrug their shoulders and say America's less religious or something. But they have to realize there are people all along who want the breakdown of the family. That is their goal. In 1848, Karl Marx, who is still read and still respected in some circles, wrote about the need to abolish the family in the Communist Manifesto. He did not want children being raised by parents. He wanted the government to assume that role. I think it is not a coincidence that in the 1960s, at the time of great subsidy of fatherless homes, was also a high tide for feminism. And Kate Millay, a very important feminist that I think some young people don't know, said that destroying the American family was necessary to bring about the left-wing cultural revolution. So I think today our children are sometimes thought that the feminist movement is a positive, but places where Black Lives Matter was having a rally or carrying signs, that at that time, before it was taken down out of embarrassment, they said that they were calling upon the end of the Western prescribed nuclear family. So let's not forget that despite the fact that on their website, where Black Lives Matter was calling for the end of the nuclear family, dozens, perhaps hundreds of people in this body showed up at places showing support of Black Lives Matter, as well as the chief executives of our largest corporations frequently giving money to Black Lives Matter because apparently they thought it was the trendy thing, the way America was going. Last month, in another bit of evidence that the hard left likes to believe the nuclear family is outdated, there was a Supreme Court decision dealing with adoption laws, and this wasn't the reason for the decision. The decision wound up being unanimous. But Justice Jill Karofsky of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and in Wisconsin, our Supreme Court justices are not partisan elections, but everybody knows who the Democrat is and who the Republican is. So the Democrat, relatively new justice up here, writes that the notion that the marriage serves as the foundation of society is at best outdated and at worst misogynistic. Think about that. In a state like Wisconsin, where frequently Republicans win statewide, we have a U.S. Senator Ron Johnson here, but a woman got elected to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court, and here she declares that the notion that marriage serves as the foundation of society is at best outdated and at worst misogynistic. Letting the cat out of the bag, the goal of the left is to destroy the American family. Now, how is President Biden responding to this in his proposed budget? There are many programs out there which are made available as long as there's not a breadwinner in the family, particularly as long as there is not a man in the family, which I think they're really aiming at, then those programs kick in. And some of these programs are, it appears to me, increased in this budget, which in other words further pushes for financial reasons getting the men out of the household. President Biden tries to increase more low-income housing, frequently available to one-parent families, not to married couples. Earned income tax credit, a horrible program which was begun actually or pushed by a Republican, Jack Kemp, but another program which discourages marriage. SNAP increases, discourages marriage. Things like Pell Grants, a program much easier to take advantage of, college scholarships, if you don't have a two-parent family at home. It's very disappointing that President Biden has decided to put all this money into programs designed, I think, to assist primarily fatherless homes. But we have to stand up as a Congress and say, no, we are no longer going to push one lifestyle over another. It would be a good thing if we went back to a time where the government was not so putting their thumb on the scale as to what type of family you have. And I hope that my Republican colleagues in the appropriation committees, when they see the increase in these programs, make sure that they don't come about, but in fact do the opposite, that they turn around and begin to work our way back to the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, where we did not punish parents for getting married. I want to, on that Pell Grant thing, recount an anecdote I've talked about before. I have spoken about this topic for over 20 years now, and I once was speaking to a group of primarily senior citizens. It was during the Tea Party thing, and they were older people, and I went through all the programs that you lost if you married a guy with an income. And I talked to, there was a young gal in the working at that time. Most of the people, those familiar with the Tea Party movement, know a lot of the people that were older, but there's a young gal. And I asked her what she thought about my speech and all the benefits out there to discourage people from getting married. And she told me, she said, you know, me and my husband, we got married before he had a child, but none of my friends got married. They get free college. And I realized even then that the 24 or 25-year-olds, they had it figured out. They had, sadly, I think in the long run it's not to their benefit, but they already realized that the goal of the American government was to discourage marriage and do what they can to give programs based upon the idea of having not a man in the family. So my hope is that we begin to work our way back to a time where the two-parent family, now they're wonderful parents raising children in all sorts of circumstances, but no longer create a situation in which there are incentives to keep the man out of the household. My final comment, we had some votes recently with regard to American aid to Ukraine, and I believe that once we have gone down the path we've gone down, we cannot allow Ukraine to collapse. That being said, it bothers me that to this day the Biden administration does not talk about trying to end this war. Okay, we have two countries that are actually very closely related. In my district, when you run across someone that's Russian, they very frequently have a spouse from Ukraine or the other way around. And it seems to me a real tragedy that a huge number of people, tens of thousands of people of both countries are dying because of that war. Ukraine has the second lowest birth rate in the world. It is such a tragedy. It's always a tragedy when people die. But to have a country in which so many young people dying is truly a tragedy. They have the same problem in Russia, a birth rate that is too low. Not only is the birth rate too low, however, but they also have a huge immigration problem. I know in this country, having been down at the southern border, it is not unusual to have Russians come in there. I know a few people in my district, including a young couple with children that I'm sure Russia would love to have, but they left Russia to come here. That was before the war started. So the goal of both Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Putin ought to be to try to get more young people to populate their rather large countries, not to have this war go on. And I think they both must realize this if they really want what's best for the future of our countries. So I would hope that President Biden, in addition to asking for more war, more munitions for the war, would find some country, be it Israel, be it Turkey, whatever country, to try to negotiate an end to this war. It is such a tragedy to see tens of thousands of young people dying on both sides when, from what I can see, the biggest problem that both countries have is a lack of young people in the first place. So I would ask President Biden to spend a little time on that. When I have met in the past with his advisors or his cabinet on this issue, they really just seem dumbfounded when I ask them about when the war is going to end. It's like something they haven't considered. Well, it is something we should consider. It's also bad geopolitically from the United States. We saw earlier this week meetings between Red China and Russia. I know going back to President Nixon, we did not want close ties between Russia and China, but we've been very careful to make sure that hasn't happened, but you leave it to President Biden. We now have closer ties with those countries, as well as closer ties with Iran, another country that we don't like to necessarily see prosper or become a part of an alliance against the United States. So my third request for this body is that we try to prod the Biden administration in looking to an end to this war so these two great historical countries do not continue to lose their younger population. So to go over one more time, we have to have Americans still be aware we're hitting records of people coming across the southern border. We have to remind people at home that this breakdown of the family did not just happen. It happened because this Congress continues to dole out money virtually conditioned upon not having an old-fashioned nuclear family, and the Biden administration is trying to throw gas on the fire in this budget. And finally, we hope members of this body prod the Biden administration towards looking for a peace in Eastern Europe. With that being said, I'd like to wrap up and hope the body proceeds as I would wish.
Does the gentleman have a motion?
Yes, I think it's maybe time that we adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until noon next Tuesday for morning hour debate.